the Appalachian Mother of Monstrosity, to cursed for the pages of recorded history. Some truths are so disturbing that history itself refuses to record them, and some families carry secrets so dark that the mountains themselves seem to swallow their existence. Deep within the isolated hollows of eastern Kentucky, where the fog clings to the hillsides like a shroud and the nearest neighbor lives miles away through impassable forest, there existed a family whose story would become whispered legend among the few who dared speak of it. This is the account of the Harlow clan, a bloodline so twisted by generations of intermarriage that by the spring of 1957, they had become something that defied natural law. It began on April 14, 1957, when a traveling Methodist preacher named Reverend Thomas McKinley lost his way while attempting to reach a small congregation in Breathitt County. The mountain roads were treacherous that season, washed out by heavy rains that had pounded the region for 3 consecutive weeks. As his automobile struggled through the muddy paths, the engine finally surrendered, leaving him stranded as darkness descended upon the Appalachian wilderness. McKinley was a man of 53 years, weathered by decades of bringing the gospel to remote communities. He had seen poverty, isolation, and hardship in these mountains, but nothing could have prepared him for what he would encounter that night. Following a barely visible trail through dense laurel thickets, he spotted a dim light flickering in the distance. As he approached, the structure that emerged from the fog was unlike any dwelling he had seen in his travels. The house, if it could be called that, appeared to have grown organically from the mountainside itself. Constructed from weathered logs and stones, it leaned precariously to one side, its roof a patchwork of rusted tin and moss-covered shingles. Smoke rose from a crooked chimney, and the windows glowed with the orange light of oil lamps. The smell that reached McKinley's nostrils was overwhelming. A mixture of rot, unwashed bodies, and something else he couldn't identify, something that made his stomach turn. He knocked on the warped wooden door, which hung awkwardly on leather hinges. The sounds from within ceased immediately. Footsteps approached, slow and shuffling, accompanied by a strange dragging noise. When the door creaked open, McKinley found himself face to face with a woman who would haunt his nightmares for the remainder of his life. She was perhaps 40 years old, though her appearance made precise aging impossible. Her face was asymmetrical in a way that went beyond mere plainness. One eye sat significantly higher than the other, both clouded with cataracts. Her jaw protruded unnaturally, teeth visible even with her mouth closed, pointing in multiple directions. Her body was twisted, one shoulder hunched dramatically higher than the other, and her hands, gnarled and malformed, clutched the doorframe for support. She wore a stained dress that might have once been blue, now faded to an indeterminate gray. "Lost are the..." she rasped, her voice thick and wet as if speaking through fluid. Behind her, McKinley could see movement in the shadows. More figures, all exhibiting similar physical irregularities. A child, perhaps 10 years old, crawled across the floor rather than walked, his legs bent at impossible angles. Another figure, taller, stood in the corner, head tilted at such a severe angle that it nearly touched his shoulder. "My automobile has failed me," McKinley managed, his throat dry. "I seek only shelter until morning light, if you would be so charitable." The woman studied him with her mismatched eyes, then nodded slowly. "Harlow hospitality," she said, stepping aside with difficulty. "Ma always said turn none away from the door, though ain't nobody found us in near 20 year." As McKinley entered, the full horror of the Harlow household revealed itself. In the main room, illuminated by the dancing flames of the fireplace and 2 oil lamps, sat what appeared to be 3 generations of profound genetic damage. An elderly woman, whom he assumed was the matriarch, occupied a crude rocking chair. Her spine was so severely curved that she was nearly folded in half, her face permanently directed toward her lap. She made soft moaning sounds, rocking back and forth with mechanical regularity. On a filthy mattress in the corner lay a young woman, barely 20, cradling an infant. The mother's features were so distorted that determining where one facial structure ended and another began was nearly impossible. Her nose was barely present, just 2 small openings in the center of her face. The infant she held was eerily quiet, its tiny form exhibiting the same characteristic malformations that marked every member of this family. 4 children of various ages occupied the room. None could be considered physically normal by any measure. One girl, approximately 12, had such severe microcephaly that her head appeared no larger than a grapefruit, though her body was that of a typical adolescent. A boy who looked to be 8 or 9 had hands with only 3 digits each fused together in a claw-like configuration. The crawling child McKinley had seen earlier dragged himself to a bowl of what appeared to be cornmeal mush, eating with animal-like intensity. The woman who had answered the door introduced herself as Martha Harlow, As she spoke, McKinley learned fragments of the family's history. The Harlows had lived in this hollow since before the Civil War, she explained with evident pride. Her great-great-grandfather Ezekiel Harlow had settled here in 1847, bringing with him 2 wives, though she said wives in a way that suggested they were also his sisters. The family had chosen isolation deliberately, she claimed, to preserve their pure bloodline from outside contamination. "We keep to our own," Martha said, her words slurred by her malformed jaw. "Harlow marries Harlow. That's the way it's always been. Pa said the outside world is poison. We got everything we need right here in these hills." McKinley's theological training wrestled with his human revulsion. He had read about the consequences of consanguineous reproduction, but academic knowledge paled in comparison to the living evidence before him. These were not just physical deformities. He could see the cognitive impairment in their vacant stares, the lack of comprehension in their eyes when he spoke. As the night progressed, Martha revealed more of the family structure, though whether she understood the true horror of what she described remained unclear. Her mother, the twisted figure in the rocking chair, had been born from the union of her grandfather and his own daughter. Martha herself was the product of her father and his niece, who was also his half-sister through a previous generation's intermarriage. The young woman with the infant was Martha's daughter by her own brother, who had died the previous winter from what Martha described as the falling sickness, likely severe epilepsy brought on by the accumulated genetic damage. The Reverend spent that night in a state of wakeful horror, sitting in a wooden chair near the fire, unable to close his eyes for fear of what he might see if he let his guard down. The sounds of the house were disturbing beyond description, the old woman's constant moaning, punctuated by wet coughing, the infant's strange, mewling cries that sounded more animal than human, the shuffling and dragging of bodies across the wooden floor, and occasionally a sound that might have been laughter, or might have been sobbing. With these people, it was impossible to distinguish. As dawn broke through the grimy windows, Martha offered him a breakfast of fried fatback and cornbread. McKinley declined as politely as possible, claiming an upset stomach from his previous day's travel. He asked Martha how many Harlows lived in these mountains. "Just us now," she replied, her tone suggesting sadness but perhaps not full comprehension of why this was tragic. "Used to be 3 families, spread across these hollows. The Harlow Smiths over Possum Ridge, they all died out 10 years ago. Babies kept coming stillborn, then the adults started dying young. Harlow Jones' clan down by the creek, they lasted until about 5 years back. Cousin Jeremiah, he was the last. Found him frozen one winter morning sitting by his dead fire. So now it's just us. 12 of us all together here in this house." 12 individuals, McKinley thought, all bearing the unmistakable marks of generation after generation of inbreeding. 12 human beings whose ancestors had chosen isolation and genetic purity over the natural diversity that kept populations healthy. 12 souls trapped in bodies that were monuments to mankind's capacity for self-destruction. Before he left, McKinley asked Martha if she had ever considered leaving these mountains, seeking help in the towns below. She looked at him with her misaligned eyes, genuine confusion on her distorted face. "Why would we leave? This is Harlow land. We're Harlows. Outside folks don't understand. They'd mock us, hurt us. Here, we're safe. Here, we're family." She paused, then added with something that might have been pride, "We're pure Harlow. Not a drop of outside blood in 4 generations. Ma says that makes us special." As McKinley made his way back down the mountain that morning, having repaired his automobile with wire and prayer, he carried with him the weight of what he had witnessed. But what haunted him most was not the physical horror, devastating as that was. It was the realization that the Harlows had chosen this fate, had embraced it, had believed themselves superior because of it. They had isolated themselves so completely that they had no reference point for normalcy, no understanding that their condition was not natural, but the result of decisions made by their ancestors more than a century before. The Reverend would later describe this night in his private journal, but he would never speak of it publicly. The Harlow name would remain unknown to the wider world for years to come, just another forgotten family in the vast Appalachian wilderness, dying slowly in the prison of their own bloodline, Confirace Jea Inscrito Nescanal. If you want to uncover the darkest secrets that history tried to bury, secrets so disturbing they'll change how you see humanity, subscribe now. McKinley's encounter with the Harlow family would have remained just another dark memory from his ministry in the mountains. But 3 weeks after that fateful night, a decision was made that would expose the Harlow secret to the outside world. The Reverend could not shake the images from his mind. The children especially haunted him. He had seen poverty before, had witnessed the harsh realities of Appalachian life, but those children represented something different, something that demanded intervention regardless of the family's wishes. On May 7, 1957, McKinley made his way to the Breathitt County Courthouse in Jackson, Kentucky. There he met with Sheriff Clayton Wolfe, a man in his late 50s who had served as law enforcement in these parts for over 20 years. Wolfe was a pragmatic man, hardened by mountain justice and the isolation that bred its own set of rules in these hollows. He listened to McKinley's account with growing concern, though not surprise. Reverend Wolfe said, leaning back in his creaking chair, "You ain't the first to mention strange families back in them hills. These mountains are full of folks who don't want nothing to do with the outside world. But what you're describing, that's beyond the usual mountain ways. That's something that needs addressing." Wolfe assembled a small party for the expedition. Alongside the sheriff came Deputy Robert Hayes, a younger man of 32 who had grown up in these mountains and knew the terrain. They also brought Dr. Samuel Pritchard, the county's only physician, a man of 67 who had practiced medicine in eastern Kentucky since the 1920s. Dr. Pritchard had delivered hundreds of babies in these mountains and had seen his share of genetic abnormalities resulting from cousin marriages, which were not uncommon in isolated communities. But even he was unprepared for what awaited them. The party departed on May 10, 1957, a Friday morning that dawned clear and cool. Spring was fully upon the mountains now, and the journey that had taken McKinley hours in the rain was accomplished in relative ease under favorable conditions. They followed the Reverend's directions, marking their path as they went, understanding that if intervention was necessary, they would need to find this place again. When they arrived at the Harlow dwelling in the early afternoon, the scene was different from McKinley's nighttime visit, but no less disturbing. In the daylight, the full poverty and degradation of the homestead became apparent. The yard, if it could be called that, was littered with refuse. Piles of bones from butchered animals lay scattered about, picked clean by dogs and wildlife. A crude pen held 2 emaciated pigs. Chickens wandered freely, pecking at the ground between piles of human waste that indicated the family had no proper sanitation facilities. Several family members were visible outside when the party arrived. A man, perhaps in his 30s, sat on the sagging porch. His appearance was shocking even to those prepared by McKinley's description. His head was disproportionately large, with a severely protruding forehead that overhung his eyes. His arms were of unequal length, one appearing normal while the other stopped at the elbow, ending in a paddle-like appendage with fingers barely distinguishable from the mass of flesh. He watched the approaching men with a mixture of fear and confusion. 2 children played, though their activity bore little resemblance to normal childhood games. They were digging in the dirt with their hands, making grunting sounds that seemed to be their only form of communication. Both displayed the characteristic malformations that marked this family. One had legs that bowed so severely she could not stand upright, instead moving in a painful-looking crouch. The other child's face was so compressed that his features seemed to merge into one another, with barely any space between nose, mouth, and eyes. Martha appeared in the doorway when the men called out. In the daylight, her deformities were even more apparent than they had been by lamplight. She shaded her eyes with one twisted hand, squinting at the visitors. Recognition dawned when she saw McKinley. "Preacher man came back," she said, her voice carrying that same wet quality. "Brought others." There was suspicion in her tone now, an animal wariness of intrusion. Sheriff Wolfe introduced himself and explained their purposes as gently as possible. They were there to help, he said, to ensure the family had access to medical care and to assess the living conditions. Martha's response was immediate and hostile. "Don't need no help, don't want it. This is Harlow land. You got no right." Her distorted face contorted further with anger. "We take care of our own. Always have." Dr. Pritchard stepped forward, his medical bag in hand. "Ma'am, I'm just here to examine you and the children to make sure everyone is healthy, that's all. Nobody's trying to cause trouble." What followed was a tense negotiation that lasted over an hour. Martha insisted they leave. The man on the porch, whom she identified as her brother Jacob, began making distressed moaning sounds, rocking back and forth. From inside the house came the sounds of the other family members, aware that strangers had invaded their isolated world. Eventually, perhaps sensing that these men would not leave without some concession, Martha allowed Dr. Pritchard to examine 3 of the children. What he found would be documented in a medical report that would later become part of county records, though it would remain buried in archives for decades. The first child, a girl named Sarah, who Martha claimed was 7 years old, though she appeared no older than 4, exhibited severe developmental delays. She could not speak coherently, producing only guttural sounds. Her skull was misshapen, smaller than normal, with a pronounced bulge on one side. Her eyes, while similar in their placement, were different colors, one blue and one brown, and neither tracked properly, suggesting vision problems or neurological damage. Her limbs were thin and weak, with poor muscle tone. When Dr. Pritchard attempted to test her reflexes, she showed little response, consistent with significant nerve damage. The second child, a boy of approximately 10 named Caleb, was perhaps the most disturbing case. His spine was severely deformed, creating a hunchback so extreme that his chin rested on his chest. He could not lift his head more than a few inches. His hands were curled into permanent fists, the fingers fused together in places. Most alarmingly, he appeared to have limited cognitive function, unable to follow simple commands or respond to his own name. He stared vacantly at nothing, drool running continuously from his slack mouth. The third child was the crawling boy McKinley had seen, named Ezekiel after the family's founding patriarch. His legs were not merely bowed but turned inward at the knees, making standing impossible. His feet pointed backward in relation to his body. Dr. Pritchard had never seen such severe skeletal malformation in a living child. Beyond the physical deformities, Ezekiel showed signs of severe intellectual disability, unable to communicate beyond primitive gestures and sounds. As Dr. Pritchard conducted his examinations, Deputy Hayes documented the living conditions inside the house. What he recorded painted a picture of medieval squalor existing in mid-20th century America. The family of 12 lived in essentially 2 rooms. They slept together on mattresses and piles of rags on the floor. There was no running water. They drew from a spring a quarter-mile down the hillside. No electricity, no telephone, no radio. Their diet consisted primarily of cornmeal, beans, and occasional meat from trapped animals or their thin livestock. The children showed signs of malnutrition, their bodies not only malformed but also underdeveloped from lack of proper nutrition. The old matriarch, still bent double in her rocking chair, was identified as Prudence Harlow, age 63 but appearing decades older. She had not left that chair in over 15 years, Martha explained, her body too deformed to walk. She required assistance for all basic functions. Yet she remained the family's authority figure, the keeper of their history, and the enforcer of their isolation. Sheriff Wolf attempted to speak with Prudence, kneeling beside her chair so she could see him without having to raise her permanently bent head. Her voice, when it came, was barely audible, a crackling whisper. Harlow land. Harlow blood. Leave us be. We hurt nobody. We ask nothing. Just leave us be. It was a plea born of fear, the terror of those who have hidden from the world for generations, facing the reality that they could hide no longer. Wolf felt a conflict between his duty to enforce what little law existed in these remote areas and the understanding that these people, however damaged, however disturbing, were victims of decisions made long before they were born. Dr. Pritchard took Sheriff Wolf aside, out of earshot of the family. His face was grave, his voice low but urgent. Clayton, I've seen cousin marriages produce problems, you know that. Cleft palates, extra fingers, things like that. But this is beyond anything I've encountered. This is what happens when the same small genetic pool is used over and over for generations. It's not just 1 or 2 problems. It's systemic. Every single person in that house has severe genetic abnormalities, and it's compounding. The children are worse than the adults, which means the damage is accelerating. What can be done? Wolf asked, though he suspected he knew the answer. From a medical standpoint, nothing. The damage is done. These deformities are permanent. But going forward, this family line needs to end. If those young women continue to bear children with family members, the next generation will be even worse. We're talking about non-viable births, stillbirths, or infants that die in days. We're talking about suffering that serves no purpose. The expedition returned to Jackson as the sun set behind the mountains, carrying with them photographs, medical notes, and the weight of what they had witnessed. In the following days, discussions were held about what, if anything, could be done. The year was 1957. The civil rights movement was beginning to challenge governmental overreach. But in the remote hollows of Kentucky, families like the Harlows existed outside the reach of most social services. A report was filed with the state health department, but it would languish in bureaucratic limbo for months. The Harlows were not committing crimes, not in the legal sense. They were simply living as they had always lived, by rules established generations before, isolated from a society that had no framework for dealing with such an extreme case of self-inflicted genetic catastrophe. Meanwhile, back in their mountain hollow, the Harlow family continued their existence, aware now that their secret had been exposed, that the outside world knew of them. The fear this knowledge brought would have its own consequences as the story of the Appalachian Mother of Monstrosity continued to unfold. Through the summer and fall of 1957, the Harlow family continued their isolated existence. But the intrusion of the outside world had planted seeds of change that would grow in unexpected ways. The knowledge that authorities knew of their presence created paranoia within the household, particularly in Prudence, the bent matriarch whose mind, despite her body's limitations, remained sharp in its own twisted way. In late September, a social worker named Eleanor Whitman was assigned to check on the family. At 38 years old, Whitman had worked with impoverished families throughout eastern Kentucky for over a decade, but she had never encountered a case like the Harlows. Armed with Dr. Pritchard's report and the sheriff's documentation, which made the journey into the mountains, accompanied by Deputy Hayes for safety, they arrived to find the situation had deteriorated. The young mother McKinley had seen with an infant now sat in the corner rocking an empty blanket. The child had died, Martha explained with flat affect, 3 weeks prior. They had buried it behind the house in the family cemetery where dozens of Harlows rested, most of whom had not lived to see their 5th birthday. Baby never took to breath and right, Martha said, her malformed jaw working to form the words. Came out blue, stayed blue. Lasted 4 months, longer than the last 3. Her tone suggested this was simply the expected course of events, not a tragedy but a routine outcome. Eleanor Whitman felt her professional composure cracking. She had worked with infant mortality before. It was tragically common in these mountains. But to hear it discussed with such casual acceptance, to understand that this family had normalized the death of children because their bloodline produced only the damaged and doomed, was overwhelming. She attempted to discuss options with Martha and the other adults capable of communication. There were facilities, she explained, places in Lexington and Louisville where some of the children might receive care, where the family might find support. The response was uniform rejection. This was Harlow land. They were Harlows. The outside world had nothing for them but mockery and cruelty. Jacob, the brother with the massively overgrown forehead, became agitated during this discussion. He began shouting, his words mostly incomprehensible but his meaning clear. Strangers were not welcome. This intrusion was a violation. He moved toward Whitman with aggressive intent, his unequal arms flailing. Deputy Hayes intervened, positioning himself between them, his hand on his revolver but not drawing it. The situation was diffused only when Prudence called out from her chair, her crackling voice commanding Jacob to stop, which he did immediately, retreating to a corner where he rocked and muttered to himself. What Whitman documented during this visit would become crucial to understanding the full scope of the Harlow tragedy. She noted the presence of 2 pregnant women in the household. One was Martha herself at approximately 40 years old, carrying what would be her 7th child. The father was Jacob, her brother, continuing the pattern that had defined this family for over a century. The second pregnant woman was Sarah, the severely deformed 7-year-old girl Dr. Pritchard had examined months earlier, except Sarah was not 7. She was 14, her growth so stunted by malnutrition and genetic damage that she appeared to be a young child. And the father of the child she carried was Caleb, the hunchbacked boy. The winter of 1957 descended upon the Appalachian Mountains with brutal force, and for the Harlow family, it would be their last season together. Eleanor Whitman had filed her report with growing urgency, but bureaucratic processes move slowly, especially when dealing with a situation so unprecedented that no clear legal framework existed for intervention. In early December, a heavy snowstorm blanketed the region, isolating the Harlow Hollow completely. For 3 weeks, no one could reach them, and they could not leave. When the thaw finally came in early January 1958, Sheriff Wolf and Dr. Pritchard made what would be their final visit to the property. What they found was a scene of devastating loss. The house was silent in a way that felt wrong, absent the usual sounds of the family's existence. Martha met them at the door, her twisted form more bent than before, her eyes hollow with exhaustion and something deeper, something that might have been the first stirrings of understanding. 4 family members had died during the isolation. The old matriarch Prudence had finally succumbed, her bent body giving out on Christmas Eve. 2 of the children, including young Ezekiel who could only crawl, had perished from what Martha described as fever and coughing, likely pneumonia that their weakened bodies could not fight. Most tragically, Sarah had died during childbirth, her 14-year-old body already malformed and underdeveloped, unable to survive the ordeal. The infant had been stillborn, another Harlow who never drew breath. Jacob sat on the porch despite the cold, staring at nothing, his massive forehead casting shadows over his eyes. He no longer spoke, had not spoken since Prudence's death, Martha said. Something in him had broken, the fragile thread of comprehension that had sustained him finally snapping. Dr. Pritchard examined the surviving family members. Martha's pregnancy had ended in miscarriage during the difficult winter. The remaining children were in deteriorating health, showing signs of advanced malnutrition and untreated infections. The house itself had begun to collapse in places, the roof leaking, the walls no longer providing adequate shelter from the elements. "Martha," Sheriff Wolf said gently, "you can't continue here. The family can't survive another winter like this. Let us help you. There are places where they'll put us in cages," Martha interrupted, her voice bitter but tired. "Places where folks will stare and point and call us monsters. We know what we are, Sheriff. We know what we look like. But here we're just Harlows. Out there we'd be freaks." Yet beneath her resistance, Wolf sensed something shifting. The deaths had affected Martha in ways the previous visits had not. For the first time, he saw doubt in her misaligned eyes, a questioning of the isolation that had been the family's defining principle for generations. Over the following weeks, through patient negotiation and with the involvement of state health officials, arrangements were gradually made. It was not a forced removal, but a slow dissolution of a family that had finally reached the limits of its biological viability. The process was handled quietly, with minimal documentation, as authorities recognized the sensitivity of a situation that reflected poorly on decades of governmental neglect of isolated mountain communities. By March of 1958, the Harlow homestead stood empty. The surviving family members had been placed in various institutions and care facilities across Kentucky, separated by necessity, as no single facility could manage their complex medical needs. Martha was sent to a state hospital in Lexington, where she would spend her remaining years, dying in 1962 at the age of 45 from complications related to her lifelong deformities. Jacob was institutionalized in a facility for the severely disabled, where he lived in silent isolation until his death in 1965. The surviving children were placed in specialized care facilities, though most would not survive into adulthood, their bodies too damaged by the genetic legacy they carried. The house itself was eventually burned by the county in the spring of 1959, a decision made partly for safety reasons and partly to erase the physical evidence of what had existed there. The land reverted to the state, and within a few years, the forest had reclaimed the clearing, nature covering the scars of human folly. If you followed this story to this point, you understand why these histories must be told. Comment below. The truth cannot stay buried, so I know you're standing with me in refusing to let these stories be forgotten. The story of the Harlow family could have ended with the closure of their homestead, but the implications of their existence rippled through the medical and social service communities of Kentucky for years. Afterward, Dr. Pritchard, in his final years of practice, became something of an unwilling expert on the consequences of extreme consanguinity. Consulted by colleagues who encountered similar cases in remote areas, in 1960 he co-authored a paper, published in a limited circulation medical journal, that documented the Harlow case without naming the family directly. The paper detailed the progressive genetic deterioration observed across multiple generations of intensive inbreeding, noting how each successive generation exhibited more severe abnormalities than the last. It explained the compounding effect of recessive genes, how harmful mutations that might remain hidden in a diverse population became expressed and amplified when the genetic pool contracted to a handful of individuals sharing the same ancestry. The medical community's response was subdued. The paper was acknowledged but not widely distributed. In the social climate of the early 1960s, there was discomfort with discussing such cases, particularly when they involved topics like intergenerational reproduction within families. The Harlow story represented an uncomfortable truth about what could happen in isolated communities left to their own devices for too long. Eleanor Whitman continued her social work in Appalachia, but the Harlow case fundamentally changed her approach. She became an advocate for improved access to healthcare and education in remote areas, arguing that isolation itself was a danger when it allowed harmful practices to continue unchallenged generation after generation. She pushed for better road access to mountain communities, for visiting nurse programs, for anything that might prevent another family from suffering the Harlow fate. Reverend McKinley, whose chance encounter had brought the family to official attention, wrestled with the moral dimensions of what had transpired. Had intervention helped or harmed? The family members who survived their removal from the Hollow had not thrived in institutional settings. They had been taken from the only home they knew, separated from each other, placed among strangers who often treated them with fear or revulsion despite the professional setting. Several had died within years of their removal, and McKinley wondered if their deaths had been hastened by the trauma of separation from their mountain home. Yet the alternative, leaving them isolated until the bloodline died out naturally through increasingly severe genetic damage and infant mortality, seemed equally cruel. There were no good answers, only the tragic reality that the Harlow situation had been allowed to develop over more than a century of isolation and societal neglect. In the decades that followed, the Harlow name faded from active memory. The official records were scattered across various county and state archives, never compiled into a complete narrative. Those who had direct knowledge of the case, like Sheriff Wolf and Dr. Pritchard, eventually passed away, taking their detailed memories with them. The burned remains of the homestead were swallowed by forest, leaving no visible trace that a family had lived and died there. By the 1980s, when researchers began systematically studying the health impacts of isolation in Appalachian communities, the Harlow case had become obscure enough that it was overlooked. A few fragmentary references existed in medical literature, anonymous case studies that hinted at the horror without providing the full context. The photographs taken during the official visits in 1957 were buried in county archives, their subjects unidentified in the filing systems. What made the Harlow case particularly significant was not that it was unique, but that it represented an extreme example of a pattern that had occurred repeatedly throughout isolated regions. Small communities, cut off by geography and sometimes by choice, had intermarried for generations. Most had not reached the extreme genetic devastation of the Harlows, but many had experienced elevated rates of genetic disorders, developmental disabilities, and shortened lifespans. The broader lesson, largely unlearned in the Harlow's own time, was about the danger of isolation, both genetic and social. Human populations require diversity to remain healthy. When groups isolate themselves, whether through geographic necessity or deliberate choice, the genetic consequences compound over generations. Combine genetic isolation with poverty, lack of medical care, and absence of education, and the results can be catastrophic. The Harlow family had believed they were preserving something pure by maintaining their bloodline without outside influence. Instead, they had created a biological dead end, lineage so damaged by accumulated genetic mutations that it could not sustain itself. The pride in their pure Harlow blood had been their destruction, a cautionary tale about the dangers of taking any ideology, even one rooted in family loyalty and tradition, to its extreme conclusion. Today, the hollow where the Harlows lived is indistinguishable from thousands of other remote valleys in the Appalachian Mountains. Hikers occasionally pass through the area, unaware of the history beneath their feet. The cemetery where generations of Harlows were buried has been reclaimed by undergrowth, the crude wooden markers long since rotted away. No monument exists to mark their existence or their suffering, yet their story persists in fragments in medical journals and dusty archives, in the memories of the few remaining individuals who encountered them directly. It persists because it matters, because it illustrates profound truths about human genetics, about the importance of community connection, and about the consequences of isolation taken to its extreme. The Appalachian Mother of Monstrosity was not a person but a phenomenon, a culmination of generations of choices that led inexorably to genetic catastrophe. It was a story too disturbing for its own time to fully acknowledge, too complicated for easy moral judgments, and too tragic to be forgotten, despite all attempts to bury it in the silence of the mountains. The Harlow family's gone now, their bloodline finally extinct, ended not by outside intervention but by the biological impossibility of their continued existence. But their story remains, a dark chapter in the hidden history of Appalachia, a reminder that some curses are not supernatural but entirely human in origin, written in the very code of life itself, in DNA damaged beyond repair by the choices of those who came before. If you've watched until this point, you've witnessed a truth that history tried to hide. Leave a comment saying I watched until the end, so I can know who truly values these untold stories. Hit the like button if this story impacted you. Share it with someone who needs to understand that the darkest horrors are often the most human. And subscribe to this channel because there are more buried truths waiting to be uncovered. More families whose stories deserve to be told. More history that refuses to stay silent. The Harlows are gone, but their story lives on as a warning, a tragedy, and a testament to the consequences of isolation taken to its ultimate extreme.